The gavel was about to fall, splintering a family forever. Mayor Caldwell stood on the wooden boardwalk of Oakhaven, a cruel smile hidden beneath his waxed mustache as he prepared to auction off Claire Higgins' children to settle a dead man's debt. 9-year-old Sarah wept into her mother's skirts. 12-year-old Thomas clenched his trembling fists, while Claire begged the unforgiving crowd for mercy. Then, the rusted saloon doors swung open. A towering figure stepped into the blinding Wyoming sun. Shepard Ward, a scarred mountain man whispered about only in fireside legends. He didn't ask. He didn't bargain. He threw a heavy, blood-stained leather sack of raw gold into the dust and growled the words that froze the town. "I'll take her, and every one of her children." The Wyoming Territory, in the summer of 1881, was a crucible that burned away the weak and hardened the survivors into something brittle and sharp. The town of Oakhaven was no exception. Nestled in a valley shadowed by the unforgiving jagged teeth of the Wind River Range, it was a place built on silver, greed, and the sweat of desperate men. For Claire Higgins, Oakhaven had become a sun-baked purgatory. Just 3 months prior, her husband, Arthur, had been brought back from the deep shafts of the Black Ridge silver mine in a pitch pine box. The mine bosses called it an unavoidable collapse, an act of God. The seasoned miners whispered it was a rotten support beam the foreman had refused to replace to save a few dollars. Either way, Arthur was dead, leaving Claire a widow at 29, stranded in a frontier town with 3 children and a mountain of debt. Claire was a woman of quiet, resilient beauty. Her auburn hair, though dulled by alkali dust, framed a face possessing high cheekbones and striking, expressive green eyes. But grief and starvation had hollowed her cheeks. Since Arthur's death, the town's superficial charity had dried up faster than a creek in August. The mercantile cut off her credit. The landlord, a ruthless opportunist named Mayor Josiah P. Caldwell, doubled her rent on the small, drafty cabin on the edge of town. When Claire could no longer pay, Caldwell invoked a barbaric but entirely legal territorial statute regarding destitute widows and orphaned children. If a parent could not provide, the children became wards of the township, their labor to be auctioned off to local businesses and ranches to pay off the family's debts until they reached the age of majority. It was legalized slavery, cloaked in the guise of civic duty. On this blistering Tuesday afternoon, the entire town had gathered in front of the mayor's office. The heat was oppressive, pressing down on the dusty main street like a physical weight. Claire stood on the elevated wooden platform, her hands gripping the shoulders of her children. Her knuckles were white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Beside her stood Thomas, 12 years old, trying desperately to look like a man. He had positioned himself slightly in front of his mother, glaring at the crowd with a fierce, helpless anger. Clinging to Claire's apron was 9-year-old Sarah, her face buried in the faded cotton, sobbing quietly. In Claire's arms rested 4-year-old Billy, pale and feverish, coughing into the crook of her neck. "Ladies and gentlemen of Oakhaven," Mayor Caldwell boomed, his thumbs hooked into his velvet waistcoat. He was a portly man who sweated profusely, smelling of cheap cologne and chewing tobacco. "We are a Christian community, a lawful community. It is a tragedy when a family falls into such ruin, but the law is the law. The debts of the late Arthur Higgins stand at $412. As the widow cannot pay, we must secure the future of these children through honest, hard labor. Josiah, please," Claire pleaded, her voice cracking. "I can wash clothes, I can bake. Give me a month. Just 1 month. You can't separate my babies." Caldwell didn't even look at her. He addressed the crowd. Reverend Amos Blackwood stood in the front row, his face a mask of pious indifference, his eyes focused on his pocket watch. Next to him, Miss Hattie Carmichael, the town's most venomous gossip, whispered excitedly behind a lace fan to the baker's wife. "We will begin with the eldest boy, Thomas. Caldwell announced, ignoring Claire's choked cry. "Strong back, good for mucking stalls or working the slag piles. Do I hear $50 against the debt?" Bartholomew Snipes, a brutal rancher known for working his hands to the bone and using a horsewhip on stragglers, raised a calloused hand. 50. "No!" Thomas shouted, his voice breaking into a prepubescent squeak. He grabbed his mother's arm. "Ma, don't let him take me." 75, called out the blacksmith, a burly man who needed someone small enough to crawl into the bellows machinery. Claire fell to her knees on the rough-hewn planks, the splinters biting through her thin skirt. She wrapped her arms around Thomas and Sarah, pulling Billy tight to her chest. It was a chaotic, weeping tangle of limbs. "I beg of you," she screamed to the crowd, her green eyes wild with maternal terror. "In the name of God, someone help us. Have you no mercy?" The townspeople shifted uncomfortably, some looking down at their dusty boots, but no one stepped forward. The silence of the crowd was a deafening roar of complicity. 75 to the smithy, Caldwell called out, raising his wooden gavel. Going once, going twice, high above the valley floor, where the air was thin and smelled of pine needles and ancient snow, lived Shepherd Ward. The townspeople of Oakhaven rarely spoke his name without lowering their voices. To them, he was a savage, a ghost, a relic of a wilder time before the railroads and the silver mines. Shepherd stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, a mountain of a man clad in smoked buckskins and heavy furs, regardless of the season. His face was weathered like saddle leather, half hidden beneath a thick, dark beard peppered with gray. But it was the left side of his face that fueled the legends. 4 jagged, silvery scars ripped from his temple down to his jawline, the permanent autograph of a territorial grizzly bear he had killed with nothing but a hunting knife a decade prior. Shepherd came down from the Wind River peaks only twice a year to trade his pelts for coffee, black powder, salt, and whatever lead he couldn't cast himself. He had no use for society. Society, in his experience, was a collection of liars who hid their cruelty behind laws and religion. Years ago, before the scars, before the mountains, Shepherd had believed in people. He had a homestead in Kansas, a wife, a child on the way. Cholera and a delayed town doctor who refused to treat poor farmers had taken them both in the span of 3 agonizing days. Since then, Shepherd had turned his back on the world of men. He had ridden into Oakhaven an hour before the auction, leading a massive, heavily muscled draft horse laden with beaver and wolf pelts. He had tied his horse outside the mercantile, his Winchester .73 rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. As he packed his newly acquired supplies, the sounds of the gathering crowd drifted down the dusty street. Shepherd usually ignored the town's affairs, let them hang their thieves and elect their corrupt officials. It was no skin off his back, but the sound that reached his ears was not the angry roar of a mob, nor the celebratory cheer of a parade. It was the desperate, soul-tearing scream of a mother. Shepherd froze, his hand tightening on the reins of his horse. The sound bypassed his hardened exterior and struck a chord deep within the locked, darkened rooms of his memory. It sounded like Kansas. It sounded like the final, ragged breaths he had listened to helplessly years ago. Leaving his horse, Shepherd moved silently down the boardwalk. Despite his massive frame, he walked with the noiseless grace of a predator, the heavy fringe of his buckskins swaying gently. He stopped in the shadow of the Silver Dollar Saloon, leaning against the wooden post, his sharp, dark eyes analyzing the scene unfolding on the mayor's platform. He saw the fat mayor sweating in his finery. He saw the townsfolk standing like sheep watching a slaughter. And then he saw her. Claire Higgins was on her knees, clutching 3 terrified children to her chest like a wolf guarding her pups. Her hair had fallen from its pins, cascading around her shoulders in a fiery mess. Even from a distance, Shepherd could see the fierce, unbroken spirit in her eyes, warring with absolute despair. He saw the oldest boy stepping in front of her, trying to shield her with a thin, trembling body. A heavy, dark anger began
This
to
story
boil
was
in
posted on the
Shepard's
channel
chest.
The Rusty Saddle.
This was the
Please do not
civilization he had
repost it
abandoned.
in any
A
form.
town full of able-bodied men standing by, while a widow and her children were torn apart to settle a dead man's bar tabs and rent. "We will begin with the eldest boy, Thomas," the mayor's voice carried down the street, laced with bureaucratic indifference. Shepard watched Rancher Snipes, a man Shepard knew to be a cruel drunk who beat his horses, bid $50. He watched the blacksmith bid $75. He saw the gavel raise. Something snapped inside the mountain man. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a primal, undeniable urge to protect the weak, a violent rejection of the town's hypocritical cruelty. He had spent 10 years living by the harsh, honest laws of nature. The strong survived, yes, but in nature, a pack did not turn on its grieving mothers. Shepard shifted his rifle to his left hand. With his right, he reached deep into the heavy leather satchel slung across his broad chest. His fingers closed around a thick, cured elk hide pouch. As Mayor Caldwell's gavel descended toward the block, Shepard stepped out of the shadows and into the glaring sunlight. His heavy boots hit the hollow wooden boardwalk with a rhythmic, thunderous cadence. The crowd at the back heard the heavy footsteps and turned. One by one, the townspeople of Oakhaven fell silent, parting like the Red Sea before Moses. Men instinctively pulled their wives back. Whispers died in their throats. The shadow from the ridges had descended, and his eyes, dark as polished obsidian, were fixed on the mayor's podium. The silence that fell over the town square was absolute, broken only by the dry wind whistling through the eaves of the buildings and the muffled coughs of little Billy. Mayor Caldwell's gavel paused mid-air, his smug expression melting into a pale mask of apprehension. Even Reverend Blackwood took a nervous step backward. Shepard Ward stopped at the base of the wooden platform. Up close, the mountain man was a terrifying spectacle. The grisly scars rippled across his face as his jaw clenched. He smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and a dangerous, feral wildness. He looked up at Caldwell, his gaze cutting right through the man's cheap authority. "What is the debt?" Shepard's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like boulders shifting deep underground. It wasn't loud, but it carried perfectly in the dead silence. Caldwell swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, sir, this is a lawful town proceeding. I must ask you to." Shepard stepped up onto the platform. The wood groaned under his immense weight. He towered over the mayor by nearly a foot. "I asked you a question, little man. What is the widow's debt?" $412, Caldwell stammered, intimidated by the sheer physical presence of the man and the casual way he held the Winchester. "But the boy has already been bid on. The auction is underway. By law, the children must be." Thud. Shepard brought his right hand from under his heavy fur cloak and slammed the elk hide pouch onto the mayor's podium. The impact rattled the wood, and the leather tie loosened. Out spilled a cascade of dull, heavy yellow rocks, raw, unrefined gold nuggets, some the size of robin's eggs, plucked straight from the icy streams of the high country. There was easily $2,000 worth of gold sitting on the pine board. The crowd gasped collectively. Caldwell's eyes bulged, practically vibrating with sudden greed. "The debt is paid," Shepard stated, his voice flat and uncompromising. "Now wait just a damn minute," shouted Bartholomew Snipes from the crowd, his face flushed red. "You can't just buy a family, mountain man. That ain't how the law works here. The township takes custody, and we bid on their labor." "It's the law!" Shepard slowly turned his massive head to look down at Snipes. His scarred face remained impassive, but his eyes were pure ice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I don't give a damn about your town laws," Shepard said softly. "The debt is paid. The gold is there." He turned his back on the crowd and finally looked down at Claire. She was still on her knees, her children pressed against her. She stared up at him, her green eyes wide with a mixture of profound terror and desperate hope. He was the most frightening man she had ever seen, a scarred giant straight out of a nightmare. Yet, he was the only one who had stopped the gavel. "Get up," Shepard said to her. It wasn't a request, but a gentle command. Claire scrambled to her feet, pulling Thomas and Sarah up with her, cradling Billy. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Shepard didn't answer her directly. He looked back at Caldwell, who was already reaching greedy, trembling fingers toward the gold. "I'll take her," Shepard declared, his voice ringing out over the town square, carrying the weight of an ironclad vow, "and every one of her children." A murmur of shock rippled through the townsfolk. Hattie Carmichael let out an audible gasp, fanning herself furiously. A mountain man claiming a refined widow and her 3 children? It was scandalous. It was unheard of. It was suicide for a woman to go up into the Wind River Range with a hermit. "You can't do this," Caldwell protested, finding a shred of false courage as he touched the gold. "She is a ward of Oakhaven. You have no legal right to just claim them." Shepard stepped into Caldwell's personal space. The mayor practically squeaked, pressing his back against the railing. Shepard leaned down, his scarred face inches from Caldwell's soft, sweating one. "Listen to me very carefully, Mayor," Shepard whispered, his voice dark and deadly. "You take that gold. You clear her dead husband's ledger. If I hear that any man from this town tries to follow us, or tries to lay claim to this woman or these children ever again," Shepard rested his hand gently on the stock of his Winchester, "I will come back down from that mountain, and I will burn Oakhaven to the ground with you in it." Caldwell nodded frantically, his face drained of all color. Yes, the debt is settled, discharged in full." Shepard turned away from the trembling mayor and looked at Claire. "Gather your things, Widow Higgins. We ride in 10 minutes." Claire stood frozen. She had just traded a life of indentured servitude for her children for a journey into the unforgiving wilderness with a heavily armed stranger. "Mister," Thomas spoke up, stepping bravely in front of his mother again, his chin jutting out. "Where are you taking us?" Shepard looked down at the boy. For the first time, a microscopic softening appeared in the corners of his hard eyes. He recognized the boy's courage. "Where the air is clean, boy," Shepard said, "and where men don't sell children." Without another word, Shepard descended the stairs. He walked back to his massive draft horse, leaving the town of Oakhaven in a stunned, breathless silence. Claire looked at the faces of the people she had known for years, people who had stood by while her family was destroyed. She felt no regret leaving them. She tightened her grip on little Billy, took Sarah's hand, and looked at Thomas. "Go to the cabin," she instructed her son, her voice suddenly finding its steel. "Pack the blankets, your father's coat, and whatever dry goods we have left. Hurry." 10 minutes later, Claire and her children stood at the edge of town. Shepard had secured a second, sturdy pack mule from the livery, paying with a silver coin he tossed onto the dirt. He lifted Sarah and Thomas onto the mule, settling them amidst the soft beaver pelts. He then turned to Claire, offering his massive, calloused hand. Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking up into his scarred face. She saw no cruelty there, only a vast, lonely guardedness. She took his hand. He lifted her effortlessly into the saddle of his own great horse, handing little Billy up to her. Taking the lead ropes, Shepard Ward turned his back on the town of Oakhaven. He began the long, steep trek up toward the jagged peaks of the Wind River Mountains, leading the widow and her children away from the world of men and into the untamed wild. The trail up into the Wind River Range was less a path and more a suggestion of broken rock and ancient, twisted pine roots. For 2 days, they climbed into the biting altitude. The oppressive heat of Oakhaven gave way to a crisp, thin chill that gnawed through Claire's thin cotton dress. Shepard Ward walked ahead, a tireless engine of muscle and leather, leading the heavily burdened draft horse and the pack mule. He spoke rarely, only breaking the silence to point out a treacherous drop or to call a brief halt by a glacial stream. Claire
This
rode
story
in a
was
state of
posted on the
suspended
channel The
terror and
Rusty Saddle.
exhaustion.
Please do
She
not
held little
repost it
Billy
in any
against her
form.
chest, feeling the terrifying, dry heat radiating from his small body. The dust of the town and the exertion of the climb had settled deep in the 4-year-old's lungs. His coughing fits had turned into a wet, rattling wheeze that tore at Claire's heart. Behind her, Thomas and Sarah rode the mule in stunned silence, clinging to each other as the world they knew vanished beneath a sea of evergreens and jagged granite. "Mr. Ward," Claire called out late on the second afternoon, her voice ragged. The sky above them was turning a bruised purple, threatening an early mountain storm. "Please, we have to stop. Billy, he's burning up. He can barely breathe." Shepard halted his massive horse and turned. He walked back to Claire, his scarred face impassive, but his dark eyes instantly locked onto the shivering child. He reached out a massive, calloused hand and pressed the back of his fingers against Billy's flushed cheek. Shepard's jaw tightened. "Croup," Shepard grunted, his voice rumbling over the wind. "And mountain fever. His lungs are filling." "What do we do?" Claire asked, panic finally breaking through her stoic facade. "Do you have medicine?" "A doctor." "No doctors up here, Widow Higgins," Shepard said, turning back to the trail. "But we are close. Hold him tight. We push hard for the next hour." Claire bit back her tears, wrapping her worn shawl tighter around her dying son. The next hour was a blur of agonizing steep inclines and the encroaching, freezing dark. Just as the first drops of icy rain began to fall, the tree line broke. Nestled against the sheer rock face of a protective canyon was not the squalid, dirt floor hovel Claire had imagined, but a fortress. Shepard's cabin was a masterpiece of pioneer engineering, built from massive, hand-hewn lodgepole pines, meticulously chinked with river mud and moss. It had a heavy slate roof, a sturdy wraparound porch, and real glass panes in the windows. A stone chimney smoked faintly, promising warmth. Shepard lifted Claire and Billy from the saddle as easily as if they were made of straw. "Inside," he commanded, kicking the heavy oak door open. The interior was immaculate. The floorboards were swept clean, the walls lined with cured pelts and shelves of preserved food in glass jars. A massive cast-iron stove sat in the center of the room, radiating a deep, comforting heat. "Put him on my bed," Shepard ordered, shedding his heavy fur coat and immediately moving to the hearth. Claire laid Billy on the thick, bearskin blankets of the large corner bed. The child was lethargic, his lips taking on a terrifying blue tint. Thomas and Sarah huddled in the corner, watching their mother weep over their brother. Shepard didn't offer empty comforts. He moved with practiced, urgent efficiency. He threw logs into the stove, setting a heavy iron kettle of water to boil. From a leather pouch on the wall, he withdrew dried roots, pungent eucalyptus leaves, and something that smelled sharply of pine pitch and camphor. He ground them violently in a stone mortar. "What are you doing?" Claire asked, hovering protectively as Shepard approached the bed with a steaming, foul-smelling rag. "Moving the fluid," Shepard said simply. He gently but firmly pushed Claire aside. "Hold his arms, boy," he instructed Thomas. Thomas looked at his mother, terrified, but Claire nodded, stepping back to let the mountain man work. Shepard laid the scalding hot poultice directly over Billy's chest. The child shrieked, a weak, reedy sound, but Shepard held the compress down with a steady, unyielding hand. "Breathe the steam, little man," Shepard murmured, his voice suddenly dropping its gruff edge, becoming a soothing, deep baritone. "Fight for it. I know it burns. Fight it." For 6 agonizing hours, the cabin was a battleground. Shepard never left the bedside. He continuously boiled water, replaced the poultice, and forced a bitter tea made of willow bark and yarrow down Billy's throat drop by drop. Claire watched, exhausted, as the terrifying giant of Oakhaven wiped the sweat from her son's brow with an unexpected, heartbreaking tenderness. Near dawn, the rattling in Billy's chest suddenly broke. He took a deep, shuddering breath, exhaled a thick wad of phlegm, and fell into a deep, natural sleep. The fever had broken. Shepard stepped back from the bed, his shoulders slumping slightly. He looked exhausted, the scars on his face pale in the morning light. He walked to the wash basin and scrubbed his hands. Claire approached him slowly, the silence of the cabin heavy with unshed tears. "You saved him," she whispered. "Why? Why did you buy us? Why do you care?" Shepard gripped the edges of the wash basin, his knuckles white. He didn't look at her, staring instead at his own reflection in the water. "A long time ago, in Kansas, I had a boy about that size," Shepard said, his voice stripped of all emotion, a hollow echo, and a wife. "Cholera took them. I didn't know the herbs then. I didn't know the mountain. I just watched them drown in their own beds, while the town doctor drank himself to sleep." He turned to look at Claire, his dark eyes filled with a century of grief. "I didn't buy you, Claire. I bought your freedom from a town that would have watched your children die just to balance a ledger. You are free to go back down the mountain whenever you please. But while you are under my roof, none of you will go hungry, and none of you will be sold." Claire looked at the scarred, terrifying man, and for the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw a shield. 2 months passed on the mountain, and the harsh Wyoming autumn began to paint the aspen trees in violent shades of gold and crimson. The Higgins family did not just survive. Under Shepard's silent protection, they thrived. A quiet, unexpected rhythm settled over the cabin. Thomas, who had initially glared at Shepard with adolescent suspicion, now shadowed the mountain man's every step. Shepard taught the boy how to track elk, how to cast lead bullets over the fire, and how to read the changing winds. Sarah helped Claire bake bread and tend to the small, hardy root garden Shepard had cultivated behind the cabin. Billy, his lungs fully healed by the pristine air, chased Shepard's massive draft horse around the meadow, laughing. Between Claire and Shepard, a fragile, unspoken tension bloomed. It was in the lingering heat of his fingers when he handed her a cup of morning coffee. It was in the way his dark eyes followed her when she brushed her auburn hair by the firelight. Claire found herself watching him split wood, admiring the raw, corded power of his back, the scars no longer frightening but a map of his survival. He was a man of few words, but his actions were a constant, steady devotion. But peace in the West is an illusion, often shattered by the greed of men. The twist came on a Tuesday, while Shepard was 5 miles up the ridge, tracking a mountain lion that had been prowling too close to the mule corral. Claire was on the front porch, hanging washed linens on a rope line. Thomas was splitting kindling near the woodpile. The wind shifted, and Thomas suddenly stopped, his axe mid-air. "Ma," Thomas said, his voice tight. Claire turned. Emerging from the timberline at the base of the meadow were 5 riders. They weren't trappers. They wore long dusters, wide-brimmed hats, and heavy gun belts. At the front rode a man with a face like a hatchet and a silver star pinned to his vest. Deputy Marshal Black-Eyed Quinn, a man known in the territory for being less of a lawman and more of a hired gun for the highest bidder. Panic seized Claire's throat. Mayor Caldwell, the gold. Shepard had paid Caldwell with raw, unrefined nuggets. Caldwell, a man driven by insatiable greed, hadn't just taken the money. He had realized that Shepard Ward was sitting on an untapped vein of placer gold, and he wanted the location. "Thomas, get the children," Claire hissed, dropping the wet linen. "Get into the root cellar under the floorboards. Now!" "But Ma, what about you?" Thomas protested, his hand dropping to the heavy hunting knife Shepard had given him. "Do as I say," Claire commanded fiercely. As Thomas corralled a crying Sarah and bewildered Billy into the cabin, Claire ran to the weapons rack above the hearth. Her hands shook as she pulled down Shepard's spare double-barreled shotgun. She broke the action, sliding 2 heavy brass shells filled with buckshot into the breeches, and snapped it shut with a sharp clack. She stepped back out onto the porch just as Quinn and his men pulled their horses to a halt at the edge of the clearing, 20 yards away.
This story was posted on the channel
now,
The Rusty Saddle.
Quinn called
Please
out,
do not repost
spitting
it
a
in any
stream
form.
of tobacco juice into the pristine mountain grass. Ain't this a cozy little domestic picture? Widow Higgins, I presume? You are trespassing, Claire yelled, leveling the heavy shotgun. The barrels wavered slightly, but her jaw was set. Turn around and ride back to Oakhaven. Quinn laughed, a dry, rasping sound. His men chuckled behind him, casually resting their hands on their holstered revolvers. Now, little lady, there ain't no need for hostilities. Mayor Caldwell sent us. Seems there was an irregularity in the paperwork regarding your late husband's debts. We're here to repossess the township's property, namely, them kids. The debt was paid in gold, Claire shouted. Ah, yes, the gold. Quinn smiled, his black eyes glinting with malice. That's the other thing. Caldwell wants to know where the wild man found it. You tell us where the claim is, and maybe we leave you and the brats be. If not, well, mountain accidents happen every day. I don't know where it is, Claire lied smoothly. And he isn't here. We know, one of the riders sneered. We watched him ride up the ridge an hour ago. He won't be back till sundown. Quinn dismounted leisurely, drawing a long-barreled Colt revolver. Take the cabin, boys. If the bitch fires that scattergun, shoot her in the leg. We need her alive to talk. 2 men spurred their horses forward. Claire didn't hesitate. She didn't faint, and she didn't beg. The frontier had burned the softness out of her, and Shepard had taught her that survival belonged to the bold. She raised the heavy shotgun to her shoulder, took aim at the lead horseman's chest, and pulled the front trigger. The boom echoed off the canyon walls like a cannon shot. The recoil bruised her shoulder to the bone, but the blast of buckshot took the rider clean out of his saddle, throwing him backward into the dirt in a spray of crimson. Get her! Quinn roared, diving behind the woodpile as the remaining 3 men opened fire. Bullets chewed through the porch railing, showering Claire in pine splinters. She ducked behind a thick support log, her ears ringing, heart hammering against her ribs. She had 1 shot left. She was pinned down, outgunned, and alone. Suddenly, a terrifying, unearthly sound split the air. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a roar of pure, feral rage that seemed to shake the very ground. From the tree line behind the riders, a massive shadow erupted. Shepard had not been 5 miles away. He had doubled back when he found the tracks of shod horses crossing his property line. He didn't use his rifle. He hit the rearmost rider at a full sprint, dragging the man from his horse with 1 massive hand and burying a heavy steel tomahawk into the man's chest with the other. It's the mountain man, one of the remaining riders screamed in terror, trying to turn his panicked horse. Shepard was a demon unleashed. The civilized restraint he had shown in town was gone. He drew his hunting knife, a wicked blade of forged steel, and lunged. Quinn stepped out from the woodpile, leveling his Colt at Shepard's broad back. Die, you savage beast, he screamed, cocking the hammer. Claire saw it unfold in agonizing slow motion. She stepped out from behind her cover, ignoring the bullets zipping past her head. She locked her eyes on Quinn, leveled the shotgun, and pulled the second trigger. The second blast from the double-barreled shotgun tore through the crisp mountain air, a sound so violent it seemed to crack the sky itself. Claire had not aimed for Deputy Marshal Quinn's chest. The recoil and her own shaking hands pulled the heavy weapon slightly to the right. The heavy buckshot chewed into the thick pine of the woodpile and ripped through Quinn's right shoulder. The lawman let out a high, reedy scream, spinning like a top before collapsing into the dirt. His silver-plated Colt revolver flew from his hand, landing uselessly in a patch of wild mountain lupine. The remaining rider, seeing his leader fall and the scarred giant of the mountain advancing with a blood-soaked tomahawk, broke. He yanked his horse's reins hard, spurring the terrified animal toward the tree line. Shepard did not chase him. He smoothly drew his Winchester from the scabbard on his back, levered around into the chamber, and fired once. The bullet struck the dirt an inch from the fleeing horse's front hooves, sending a spray of rock and soil into the animal's face. The horse reared, throwing the rider hard against the base of an ancient spruce. He lay there, groaning and clutching a broken collarbone. Silence rushed back into the clearing, heavy and absolute, broken only by Quinn's ragged whimpering. Claire stood frozen on the porch, the smoking shotgun still pressed tight against her bruised shoulder. Her chest heaved, her green eyes wide and fixed on the carnage. Shepard wiped his blade on the grass, his massive chest rising and falling rhythmically. He turned his dark eyes toward Claire, a look of profound, silent respect passing between them. She hadn't cowered. She had fought. "Ma!" Thomas's voice cracked from the doorway. The boy had pushed his way out of the root cellar, his hands gripping Shepard's hunting knife, his face pale but defiant. "Stay back, Thomas," Shepard ordered, his voice returning to its deep, gravelly rumble. He walked over to where Quinn lay writhing in the dirt. The deputy marshal was clutching his shattered shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers and staining his duster a dark, wet crimson. Shepard kicked the Colt revolver out of reach. He knelt beside the wounded man, the jagged scars on his face pulled taut into a mask of pure, unadulterated menace. "You should have stayed in Oakhaven, Quinn," Shepard whispered. Caldwell made me," Quinn gasped. His bravado entirely evaporated, replaced by the pathetic terror of a dying bully. "He wants the vein, Ward. He knows you found gold." Shepard looked back at Claire. The adrenaline of the firefight was fading, replaced by a heavy, sorrowful tension. He motioned for her to come down from the porch. Claire set the shotgun against the railing and walked on trembling legs across the blood-stained grass. "Tell her," Shepard commanded Quinn, his hand wrapping tightly around the lapels of the deputy's coat, hauling him slightly off the ground. "Tell her what you told Caldwell. Tell her where the gold came from." Claire frowned, looking from Shepard to the bleeding lawman. "What is he talking about?" "You found the gold in the river." "No, Widow Higgins," Quinn coughed, spitting a mixture of blood and dirt. "He didn't pan that gold. It's hard rock ore. Wire gold." Shepard gently let Quinn drop back into the dirt and stood up, finally facing Claire fully. The guarded, impenetrable wall he had maintained for months seemed to fracture. "Claire," Shepard said softly, the use of her first name sending a strange shiver down her spine. "There is something you need to know. Something I couldn't tell you in town, not with Caldwell watching." He reached into his heavy buckskin coat and pulled out a small, blood-stained leather journal. It was battered, its edges worn smooth by constant handling. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the tooling on the cover immediately. She had given it to her husband, Arthur, on their 3rd wedding anniversary. "Where did you get that?" Claire whispered, her hands shaking as she reached out to take it. "4 months ago, I was tracking a wounded elk deep in the Black Ridge Canyons, miles away from the company mine," Shepard explained, his voice thick with a heavy sorrow. "I found a man pinned beneath a rock slide. It wasn't an accident. The rocks had been blasted with dynamite from above." Tears welled in Claire's eyes. "Arthur, he was dying when I found him," Shepard continued, refusing to look away from her grief. "He told me he had been prospecting on his Sundays off. He found a secondary quartz vein, rich with raw gold, entirely off the company's claim map. He was going to file the deed in Cheyenne, but he made the mistake of showing a nugget to his foreman, Foreman Cobb," Claire breathed, the pieces falling into a horrifying, sickening puzzle. "Cobb told Mayor Caldwell," Shepard said, nodding. "They cornered Arthur in the canyon, demanded the location of the vein. When he refused, they set the charges and buried him. They thought they killed him instantly. They thought they buried the gold he had already mined with him." Claire clutched the journal to her chest, a sob tearing from her throat. Arthur hadn't died in a tragic cave-in. He had been murdered by the very men who had then systematically stripped her family of everything they owned, preparing to sell her children into slavery. "Arthur gave me his saddlebag before he passed," Shepard said. "It held the gold I used in town. And he
This
gave
story
me this
was
journal,
posted on the
which
channel
holds
The
map
Rusty
to
Saddle.
the real claim.
Please do not repost
His last
it in
words
any
to
form.
me were a plea to find you. To make sure Caldwell didn't destroy his family, Claire looked up at the towering mountain man. The truth washed over her like an icy river. Shepard hadn't just stumbled into Oakhaven on a whim. He had come down from his solitary exile, stepping back into the world he despised, solely to fulfill the dying wish of a man he barely knew. He had braved the town, paid the debt with Arthur's own gold, and taken the family into his protection, absorbing all the risk himself. "You." Claire choked out, the overwhelming weight of his nobility bringing her to her knees. "You did all this for us? A stranger?" Shepard knelt with her in the bloodied grass. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "A man is only as good as his word, Claire. And once I saw you on that platform, fighting for your children with everything you had, you weren't a stranger anymore." She leaned into his touch, her hand coming up to rest against the jagged silver scars on his cheek. For the first time, Shepard didn't flinch away. "They murdered my husband," Claire said, her voice dropping the sorrow and replacing it with a cold, hardened steel forged in the fires of the frontier. She looked at Quinn, then up toward the peaks. "And Caldwell thinks he can just send men to finish the job." "Caldwell overplayed his hand," Shepard said, rising and pulling Claire up with him. He looked down at the bleeding deputy. "We patch him up just enough to keep him breathing. Then, we take a ride." The descent from the high country felt entirely different than the ascent had 2 months prior. It was not the desperate, breathless flight of a terrified widow fleeing the auction block. Instead, it was the measured, unstoppable march of impending judgment. The harsh Wyoming autumn had painted the valleys in stark, unforgiving shades of gold and rust, a fitting backdrop for the retribution they carried with them. Shepard rode his great draft horse at the front of the column, his posture as rigid as the ancient pines, his scarred profile etched in granite against the crisp sky. He led the pack mule by a thick leather tether. Slumped across the mule's saddle was Deputy Marshal Quinn, pale, tightly bandaged, and shivering violently with fever, but kept stubbornly alive. Behind Shepard rode Claire. She sat straight-backed in the saddle, her chin held high against the biting mountain wind. The double-barreled shotgun rested comfortably across her lap, her hands steady on the polished wood. She was no longer the broken, hollowed-out woman who had begged for her children's lives in the dust of Oakhaven. The mountain had hardened her, and the devastating truth of Arthur's murder had forged that hardness into cold, unyielding steel. Thomas rode directly behind her on a sturdy roan they had taken from Quinn's men. The 12-year-old boy's eyes, sharp and vigilant, continuously scanned the tree lines, mirroring the silent, predatory alertness Shepard had drilled into him. Sarah and little Billy had been left behind at the cabin, securely tucked away in the reinforced root cellar with enough food and water for 3 days, guarded by the heavy iron locks Shepard had forged himself. This ride was no place for little ones. This was the business of adults. They did not head straight for the corrupt heart of Oakhaven. Halfway down the mountain, Shepard veered off the main trail, leading them toward a lonely telegraph relay station nestled in the lower foothills. The station master, an old man with spectacles thick as glass jars, blanched at the sight of the scarred giant and the bleeding lawman strapped to a mule. Shepard didn't offer explanations. He simply tossed a heavy silver coin onto the operator's wooden desk and dictated a message directly to Cheyenne. He addressed it to a man whose very name struck terror into the hearts of corrupt syndicates and crooked mayors across the territory. U.S. Marshal Frank Hadsell. Hadsell was a relentless, uncompromising federal lawman, known for tearing down mining monopolies that operated outside the bounds of civilized law. Shepard knew all too well that local justice in Oakhaven was bought and paid for with Caldwell's stolen silver and blood money. To break a man like the mayor, They needed a hammer forged in federal iron. Claire watched Shepard from the doorway of the station, a profound sense of awe washing over her. She realized then that Shepard was not merely a wild, reactive force of nature. He possessed a sharp, calculating mind that understood exactly how the world of men operated, even if he had chosen to live outside it. 2 days later, the small procession rode off the mountain trail and onto the dusty, sun-baked main street of Oakhaven. The sensory assault of the town, the smell of cheap whiskey, horse manure, and coal smoke was a stark, ugly contrast to the pristine, thin air of the high country. As they moved down the thoroughfare, the town seemingly ground to a halt. The rhythmic clop-clop of the heavy hooves sounded like a death knell against the hard-packed dirt. Men dropped their pitchforks near the livery. Women paused outside the mercantile, their parasols lowering in shock. The ghost of the Ridges had returned, bringing the widow he had stolen right back into the lion's den. But it was Claire who drew the most stares. The townsfolk remembered a weeping, starving woman in a faded cotton dress. Now, they saw a striking, fierce matriarch, with eyes like chips of green ice, holding a shotgun with lethal familiarity. Mayor Josiah P. Caldwell burst through the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, wiping a smear of beer foam from his waxed mustache. The color drained entirely from his fleshy face, then flushed violently back in a tide of panicked crimson as his eyes locked onto the pathetic, bound figure of Quinn slumped over the mule. Caldwell's gaze darted frantically to the group of armed mine guards lounging on the boardwalk. "Arrest that savage!" Caldwell shrieked, his voice cracking and echoing hysterically off the wooden storefronts. He pointed a trembling, fat finger at Shepard. "He's kidnapped a deputy. He's a murderer. Shoot him down." The mine guards hesitated. They leveled their Winchester rifles, but instinctively took a collective step backward as Shepard halted his massive draft horse in the dead center of the street. Shepard didn't flinch. He didn't draw the heavy hunting knife at his belt, nor did he reach for the rifle in his scabbard. He simply sat in the saddle, as immovable and terrifying as a mountain storm waiting to break. "You sent men to my home, Josiah." Shepard's voice boomed. It wasn't a shout, but a deep, resonant rumble that carried a terrifying, lethal calm, easily reaching every ear in the silent street. "To murder a woman and her children for a gold claim you stole from a dead man." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. Townspeople exchanged bewildered, nervous glances. "Lies," Caldwell sputtered, sweating profusely, his eyes darting around for an escape route that wasn't there. "I am the mayor of this township. I order you to fire on that man." "You ain't ordering anybody." Caldwell, a new, authoritative voice cut through the thick tension like a whip crack. From the opposite end of the street, 3 riders trotted into view, their horses moving with disciplined purpose. At the front was a man with a graying mustache, wearing a pristine Stetson and a silver star that caught the midday sun. U.S. Marshal Frank Hadsell had received the wire, ridden hard from Cheyenne, and arrived exactly when Shepard knew he would. Hadsell dismounted smoothly, his spurs jingling in the dead silence of the town. He walked purposefully past the nervous, sweating mine guards, ignoring their leveled rifles completely, and stopped before Shepard's horse. "Ward," Hadsell nodded, a flicker of deep respect in his steely eyes. "Been a long time since Kansas." "Marshal," Shepard replied respectfully, touching the brim of his hat. "I have a wounded man on that mule who's eager to confess to attempted murder and claim jumping. And I have the journal of Arthur Higgins detailing his murder at the hands of Josiah Caldwell and Foreman Cobb." Caldwell whimpered and turned to run back into the saloon. But Hadsell's deputies were already dismounting. Within seconds, they tackled the portly mayor into the dust, binding his hands roughly behind his back. Down the street, Foreman Cobb, attempting to slip out the back of the livery stable, was swiftly apprehended by the town blacksmith, the very man who had bid on Thomas months ago, now suddenly eager to align himself with federal law. The town of Oakhaven watched in stunned, breathless silence as the foundation of their corrupt little world was dragged away in iron shackles. Hadsell stepped forward, taking custody of Quinn, the blood-stained journal, and the signed, witnessed confession Claire had forced the deputy to write at gunpoint before they left the mountain. "The federal court will see this through, Mrs. Higgins," Hadsell said softly, removing his Stetson and bowing his head slightly to the widow. "The claim your husband found is legally yours. The assayer in Cheyenne confirmed the ore quality from the nuggets Shepard brought to town. You're a very wealthy woman. You could buy half this town if you wanted to, or move back east and live in high comfort." Claire remained in her saddle. She looked around at the faces of the townsfolk slowly creeping out from the boardwalks. She saw Reverend Blackwood, who had piously checked his pocket watch while her family was destroyed. She saw Hattie Carmichael, who had eagerly gossiped about her ruin. She saw the faces of the men who had stood by, silent and complicit.
This story was posted on the
Mayor
channel The
Caldwell
Rusty
auctioned
Saddle.
off her
Please do
children's
not
futures.
repost it in any
"I don't
form.
want any part of this town, Marshall," Claire said, her voice ringing out clear, strong, and utterly devoid of malice. "It was just a cold, undeniable fact. You can keep your silver dust, your polite society, and your cruelty." She turned her horse smoothly, facing away from the valley, looking up toward the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Wind River Range that cut into the blue sky. She looked at Shepard. The massive mountain man was already watching her. There was a profound vulnerability in his dark, scarred face that no one else in the world would ever be allowed to see. A silent, agonizing question in his eyes that he was far too proud and perhaps too afraid to ask aloud. She had her wealth now. She had her long-awaited justice. She no longer needed a protector. She could ride away from the harsh wilderness forever and never look back. Instead, Claire guided her horse until she was knee to knee with Shepard's great beast. In front of the entire town, she reached out across the space between them and took his calloused, scarred hand firmly in hers. The rough warmth of his grip anchored her soul. "Take us home, Shepard," she said, a soft, radiant smile finally breaking across her face, chasing away the shadows of the past year. Shepard Ward, the terrifying wild man of the ridges, let out a long, shuddering breath he felt he had been holding since Kansas. The deep, jagged, grisly scars on his cheek seemed to soften as a rare, genuine smile touched his own lips, reflecting the sunlight. "Yes, ma'am," Shepard murmured. Together, their hands still joined, they turned their backs on civilization once more. They rode out of the valley and up toward the clean, thin air of the high country, leaving the dust of Oakhaven behind them forever. The legend of the scarred mountain man and the fierce widow became a staple of Wyoming campfire lore. Claire Higgins did not return to the east. Instead, she and Shepard used Arthur's gold to build a sprawling, prosperous ranch high in the alpine meadows. They married beneath the canopy of ancient pines, binding their fractured lives together. Thomas grew into a formidable frontiersman, taking over the ranch's operations, while Sarah and Billy were educated by tutors brought up from Denver. Shepard found the peace that had been stolen from him in Kansas, his quiet strength serving as the unshakable foundation of their new family. Together, they proved that true wealth was not found in silver mines or legal ledgers, but in the unyielding loyalty and love forged in the harshest of wildernesses.